The English Channel has seen thousands of aircraft, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, lone stragglers limping back home. But on the cold morning of March 18, 1941, one particular Hawker hurricane carried a story that still makes RAF veterans shake their heads. Flight Officer Andrew Drew Halley was 23 years old. He had flown only a handful of combat missions, and this routine patrol was supposed to be uneventful. Gray sky, uneasy waters below. A formation of merchant ships tracked across the channel, hoping to avoid German dive bombers that prowled the coast. His Hurricane, a rugged, dependable machine, hummed with familiar confidence. The Merlin engine vibrated through the airframe, in that steady rhythm pilots knew intimately. Drew checked his gauges, tightened his harness, and scanned the horizon. Nothing unusual. Then, without warning, the first sign appeared. A faint tremor. Not enough to be alarming, just enough for a pilot to feel in his bones. He watched the boost pressure needle twitch. Then the RPM dipped, barely but unmistakably. The engine coughed once, then again. Drew frowned. He nudged the throttle forward. Nothing. No response. He tried again. The lever resisted him, stiff and unmoving. He looked down. The throttle was stuck. And when he tried to adjust mixture, the engine jerked, sputtered, then steadied at the wrong setting, dangerously lean. He tapped the glass on the mixture gauge, as if that ever helped. It didn't. Below him stretched 20 miles of freezing water. A forced landing here in March meant minutes, maybe less, before hypothermia took over. He pressed his radio switch. "Control, this is Hurricane 2-1. I've got a throttle issue, losing power." Static. Then, through the crackling interference, a voice. 2-1, say again." He repeated his message, more urgently now. The tremor in the engine grew. The vibration deepened. He could feel the power bleeding away. The plane was slowing. Not enough to fall, but enough to trap him between flying and stalling. The most dangerous airspeed of all. From the ground, the engineers and officers listening to his call exchanged glances. They knew something Drew didn't. A jammed throttle on a Hurricane wasn't just inconvenient. It was deadly. Up here, in the cold silence above the sea, Drew Halley understood one thing. If the engine stopped, he was dead. The channel swallowed aircraft whole. Pilots who ditched rarely survived long enough for rescue. He tried again to force the throttle. Nothing. He pulled on the lever so hard his glove slipped. The engine coughed and surged, then coughed again. He looked out at the horizon. Empty. At the waves below, endless. In that moment, Drew realized he was truly alone. And he had no idea that the solution to his problem was something no pilot had ever used in the sky. A piece of farm equipment, a tractor part. The RAF loved the Hurricane. It was simple, rugged, and forgiving. A pilot's aircraft. But like all machines rushed into war, it had flaws. And one flaw, barely known outside engineering circles, now held Drew Halley's life in its grip. To understand what happened, we must look at a single component buried deep inside the Hurricane's guts. The throttle linkage assembly. Early versions of the Hurricane used a system built around a series of rods and pivot arms. These transferred movement from the pilot's throttle lever to the carburetor's throttle butterfly valve. Under perfect circumstances, it worked beautifully. But the Hurricane's intake scoop sat low, dangerously low, beneath the nose. Sudden pressure changes caused by airflow, moisture, and icing could produce strange harmonics inside the intake. On rare occasions, these vibrations would travel up the linkage and cause the throttle rod to jump into an offset position. When that happened, the pilot could still move the lever, but the airflow would overpower the butterfly valve, jamming it partially open. A partially open throttle meant the engine was locked at a single power setting, often too weak for combat, too strong for safe gliding. And with the mixture misaligned, the Merlin engine would slowly starve. Drew Halley didn't know any of this. All he knew was that every second, his engine felt weaker. On the ground, however, the RAF engineers listening to him immediately understood the danger. They had seen similar failures, but only on the ground, never mid-flight. One engineer muttered, "His throttle rods jumped the stop. He can't change mixture either." Another added quietly, He's dead if that engine quits over water. The Hurricane's Merlin engine was a masterpiece, but also a diva. It demanded a precise mixture of air and fuel, too lean and it overheated, too rich and it choked. Stuck in the wrong setting, Drew's engine was running itself toward destruction, 1 second at a time, and the pilot could do nothing. Down below, the waves rolled under him, as indifferent as the sky above. He tried the throttle again, forcing it violently, but the lever was like stone. The resistance traveled through the metal into his hand, up to his elbow. Every instinct screamed, "Don't break it." But every second screamed something louder, "Do something or die." He looked at his temperature gauge, climbing, slowly, steadily, dangerously. The engine shuddered, coughing a metallic protest. The aircraft dipped slightly. "Control! I'm losing altitude." The ground team realized the window was closing. They needed to find a solution. Now. Not in a hangar, not on the ground, but in midair, over open water, with a pilot barely holding on to a dying machine. And that's when one mechanic, a man whose name seldom appears in history, remembered something strange, something improvised, something that never should have worked, yet had saved more than one engine in the field, something that didn't belong on an aircraft at all, a tractor part. The control tower at RAF Tangmere was never silent, but now it felt frozen. Every eye was locked on the radio equipment. Every breath was held as the voice of Drew Hawley crackled in and out. Losing power, engines rough, throttle unresponsive. The engineers rushed to the table where technical drawings were pinned. They slid their fingers along diagrams of the Hurricane's control systems, tracing rods, pivots, stops, and springs. They didn't have the luxury of time. They had minutes, maybe fewer. "He's got partial throttle," said one. "That's worse than none," replied another. The room buzzed with calculations, whispered arguments, and frantic gestures over blueprints. "We need to get him stable," someone said. "How?" "Compensate mixture. He can't, the linkage is jammed." "Then force it into a safe range." "With what?" "He's in the air." Silence. The kind of silence that only exists when no one sees an answer. One officer ran toward the hangar, shouting orders. "Get me a Hurricane linkage kit. Now!" Mechanics scrambled. Toolboxes clattered. Someone dragged out a training carburetor. Another held up a bent rod and shook his head. "Even if we figure it out, how does he do it up there?" Meanwhile, Drew struggled to keep altitude. Every tremor from the engine sent new waves of fear through his chest. "Control? I don't think she'll hold." Back on the ground, the men stared again at the blueprint. A network of metal rods, each connected by small rotating joints. And then one mechanic, Sergeant Basil Morton, squinted, leaned in, and tapped a single point. "The throttle doesn't need to move," he said. "It needs to stay still." Heads turned. Morton continued, his voice quickening with excitement. "If he can wedge the throttle in place, even roughly, the mixture will stabilize. The Merlin will run dirty, but it'll run." The engineers exchanged looks. That might work, if the pilot could wedge it tight enough, if he could reach the linkage panel, if the engine didn't fail first. Too many ifs. But it was something. A senior fitter asked, "With what would he wedge it?" Morton hesitated. "Well, anything. A wrench, a tool, even a pin." "A pin?" "Yeah. Like the kind farm tractors use on their control arms. They're short, tough, don't shear easy." Someone frowned. "Farm equipment on an RAF fighter?" Morton shrugged. "It's saved engines before, on the ground." An officer snapped to attention. "That's absurd." Morton shot back. "So is letting him drown because we're too proud to improvise." That ended the discussion. The radio officer keyed the mic. "Hurricane 2-1. Listen carefully. You need to jam your throttle at 60%. Anything you can wedge in there. Do you copy?" Up in the sky, Drew blinked. "Jam it? With what?" "Look under your right side panel. Tools, pins, anything that fits. This is your only chance." Drew stared at the trembling throttle. He reached down and began the most desperate repair ever attempted in the sky. Before we follow the pilot's struggle, we need to understand the strange, almost unbelievable origin of the tractor part idea. The RAF didn't normally use farm equipment on fighters, obviously. But war doesn't ask for elegant solutions. It wants solutions that work now. During 1940, the RAF faced a critical shortage of specific replacement components. Factories were overwhelmed with orders. Some parts, especially throttle stops, link pins, and linkage bushings, were constantly in short supply. On several remote airfields, mechanics began improvising. They noticed something peculiar: agricultural machinery. Old British tractors, plows, even hay balers used short, durable metal pins that were almost identical in size to certain aircraft linkage pins. These tractor shear pins were cheap, common, built to survive vibration, moisture, and dirt, precisely machined even on old equipment easy to fit into small control joints. The mechanics called them field stand-ins. Command didn't officially approve this practice, but they didn't stop it either. Wartime is pragmatic. Sergeant Basil Morton, the man who recalled them that morning, had used such a pin before. Not on a fighter in flight, of course, but on a grounded Hurricane whose throttle linkage had corroded overnight in damp weather. It had worked then, but could it work now, with the pilot in the air? Morton studied the throttle diagram again. If he can wedge something between the lever stop and the linkage housing, he might lock it in. The engine will settle into a predictable mix. The senior engineer rubbed his chin. That's clever, dangerous, but clever. Morton shrugged. I'd rather give him something dangerous than nothing at all. Back in the sky, Drew Halley fumbled open the side access panel. Cold air whipped into the cockpit, carrying the smell of oil and hot metal. His fingers touched the small canvas tool pouch. Inside were a stubby spanner, a flat screwdriver, 2 small metal rods, and, to his surprise, a universal pin. It wasn't exactly a tractor part, but it was close. A rugged cylindrical metal piece meant for field adjustments. Control, I found something. A small pin. Morton grabbed the microphone. Good, that's what you need. Listen closely. Every man in the control room leaned in. Push your throttle to 60%, then wedge the pin between the lever arm and the side housing. You must jam it hard, until it won't move. Drew hesitated. You want me to jam my own throttle? You want to live? Do it. The wind roared. The engine sputtered. The aircraft trembled. Drew inhaled. Then he pressed the throttle forward and began the most improvised fix of his life. Drew braced his knees against the cockpit sides to steady himself. The Hurricane shook as the engine fought uneven combustion. His hands were slick inside his gloves. His breath fogged his goggles. He gripped the tiny metal pin. Control! I'm inserting it now. Not yet, Morton barked. Throttle first. 60%. Hold it steady. Drew pushed the throttle forward. The lever resisted like a living thing, vibrating under his palm, shuddering with each cough of the engine. Okay, 60. The Hurricane lurched as the power briefly stabilized. Now, Morton said quietly, jam the pin. Drew reached down, angling the pin between the throttle lever and the bracket. The space was tiny, barely wide enough. The aircraft dipped slightly. Drew's hand slipped. He tried again. Metal scraped metal. The engine sputtered. The pin clattered to the cockpit floor. Drew cursed, grabbed it again, and jammed it harder this time. All his strength against that stubborn vibration. The pin slid into place. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the engine note changed. The cough smoothed into a rough but steady growl. The temperature stabilized. RPM steadied. Control! I think it's holding. Silence in the tower, then cheering. A few swore in disbelief. Morton exhaled. It shouldn't work, he muttered, but it did. But Drew wasn't safe yet. A jammed throttle meant one thing. The plane could fly. But he could no longer control his power. He couldn't climb. He couldn't descend easily. He couldn't adjust mixture, boost, or throttle for landing. He was locked into a single power band and would have to fly a perfect approach with absolutely no margin for error. Below him, the channel glistened like a vast steel trap. Control, he said softly. How do I get home with no throttle? Morton grabbed the mic again. You fly steady, you fly smart, and whatever you do, don't touch that pin. Drew swallowed. Understood. He banked slowly toward England. The engine, held together by a piece of metal never intended for aircraft, growled beneath him like a wounded animal refusing to die. This improvised fix had bought him a chance. Not safety, not certainty, just a chance. And in wartime, that was enough. Every pilot who flew over open water knew one truth. Returning was always harder than leaving. For Drew Halley, those 20 minutes back toward the coast felt like hours. The horizon remained stubbornly distant, the coastline a faint gray smudge refusing to grow larger. His engine rumbled steadily, too steadily. With his throttle fixed in place, every bump of turbulence felt amplified. He couldn't correct power, couldn't compensate for headwinds, couldn't lighten the load on the engine. He was flying a perfectly balanced, perfectly fragile line between survival and disaster. Control, altitude steady, airspeed steady, slight vibration. Morton's voice replied, "That's good. Keep it smooth, maintain heading." Drew scanned his instruments. Oil pressure, barely normal. Coolant temperature, on the high side. RPM, wavering but steady. The strongest danger now wasn't mechanical. It was psychological. Every minute gave him more time to imagine the pins slipping, to hear phantom coughs from the engine, to wonder what he would do if the power suddenly died. The channel below showed no mercy, cold, black, unforgiving. He forced himself to focus. He adjusted trim, corrected for drift, kept wings level, nursed the wounded machine forward. As he flew, he began to understand something RAF instructors rarely said out loud. Air combat was about skill. Survival was about ingenuity. At last, the coastline appeared clearly. Chalk cliffs, faint roads, the familiar patchwork of English fields. But landing without throttle control was a nightmare. Morton spoke calmly. "You'll need a long approach. Don't descend too early. Keep your nose shallow. Use altitude, not throttle, to bleed speed." "I can do that," Drew replied, though his voice betrayed doubt. He lowered the landing gear. The nose dipped sharply, too sharply. He pulled back. The Hurricane wobbled but recovered. "Steady," Morton whispered, as if Drew could hear him without the radio. Approach lights came into view. The runway stretched out like salvation. Drew aligned his aircraft, wings trembling in the wind. He throttled back out of pure instinct. The lever didn't move. Right. He had jammed it. He was locked into power. He pulled the nose up slightly, flared as gently as he could. The Hurricane floated, too fast, then settled. The wheels hit the ground, hard, then again. The aircraft bounced, then stayed down. Drew held the stick firm as the plane hurtled down the runway, slowly bleeding speed until it finally came to a stop. Silence. He exhaled for the first time in minutes. He was alive, and his aircraft had been saved by a pin that wasn't meant for airplanes at all. When ground crews reached the aircraft, they found Drew still sitting in the cockpit, staring at the throttle as if unsure whether to laugh or cry. Morton climbed the ladder, leaned in, and saw the metal pin, wedged perfectly, impossibly, holding the throttle at 60%. He whistled softly. "Well, I'll be damned. He did it." The senior officer arriving behind him frowned. "What's that? Is that—" Morton answered bluntly. "A universal field pin, sir, nearly identical to the ones used on old tractors." The officer stared. "You're telling me a farm part kept a combat aircraft flying?" Morton shrugged. "Flying and landed." The officer said nothing more. An investigation followed, not out of blame, but out of fascination. Engineers reconstructed the event step by step. They studied the pin, the throttle linkage, the airflow that caused the jam. Their conclusion surprised everyone. The improvised fix was mechanically sound. The pin had acted like a temporary throttle stop, a crude but effective one. It prevented over-travel. It stabilized the butterfly valve. It locked the mixture into a survivable range. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. RAF Command quietly updated procedures for emergency throttle failures. They added more universal pins to field kits. They improved the linkage design. And while no official document ever admitted the truth, mechanics on remote fields began storing tractor pins in their toolboxes, just in case. As for Drew Halley, he was back in the air days later, flying again over the same cold water, in the same aircraft that had almost killed him. and then saved him. He later told fellow pilots, "It wasn't the wings, it wasn't the guns, it wasn't my flying. It was a piece of metal the size of my thumb." War is often described as a contest of steel and fire, of factories and nations. But stories like this reveal a different truth. Sometimes victory belongs to the smallest part, the one that shouldn't matter, the one no one designed for heroics, the one borrowed from a tractor. In the vast machinery of war, improvisation, the human ability to find a solution in desperation, is the most powerful weapon of all. And this story was only one of many, because months later, another RAF crew would use a part even stranger than a tractor pin, and that fix wouldn't just keep a plane flying, it would win a dogfight.